Thank you guys for joining us today. We're excited to bring you our next presenter in our quarterly Writers Workshop series. Today's presentation is with Allie Pleiter, and we are talking about building characters. For those of you who are in the room, let me know when you have questions and I'll ask them of Allie. And for those of us joining us on Zoom, please post them in the chat. So let me start by introducing Allie. Best-selling international author Allie Pleiter honed her talents in the world of popular fiction, where she still releases multiple books a year. Allie has over 50 published titles to her name and over 1.6 million fiction and nonfiction books have been sold around the world. Her well-known chunky method system trains writers at every level to formulate plans and meet deadlines in a way tailored to their unique working style. She's an avid knitter, confirmed coffee junkie, and a firm believer that pie makes everything better. I agree. She holds a Bachelor's of Science in Speech from Northwestern University and lives in the suburbs of Chicago with her husband and the world's most adorable dog. So welcome, Allie. I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to turn off my camera and mute, but I'll be monitoring the chat and take it away.
Terrific. Hi, thank you, everyone. I'm so glad to be here with our technology making all things possible. Give me a minute here to share my screen and make sure that you see what I want you to see. So if you see a green screen, a green textured screen that says characterizations, just give me a wonderful, yep, my chat went completely away, just like we thought. Just confirm to Jennifer so that we know you all are seeing what you need to see.
Yep, looks good over here.
Terrific. Great. Well, we're going to talk about the art of perfect pairings. Now, I come from the romance world where characterizations and the pairings of characters is the essential bones of the story. But the great thing is that the lessons that we know from the romance world actually apply to all kinds of genres. So while I'll be talking about primarily romance pairs, I'll many times refer to some of the other genres where it works, and just know that these tactics work everywhere. It just happens to be that romance is the best way to talk about them because it's where the characterization pairings are essential to the story. It's the most powerful tool that you have to draw your reader in. This is why you need to care about characterization. It's why you want to be paying attention to not only each of the characters, but how they interact. Whoops. Let's go again. It's what makes your story memorable. We love books. We admire great writing and good descriptions and things like that. But we remember and we fall in love with characters. Think about the books on your keeper shelves, the books that you've loved. Chances are you could very vividly describe for me the main characters. And it's because we're wired to remember people. And as I said, romance tactics work everywhere because the way we learn about characters, the way we fall in love with characters, the way characters come alive to us are their interaction. And like I said, the romance interaction between two characters is the bones of the story. So that's why it's an excellent place to look at. And I'm sure that as you look at your own works, as we go through some of these concepts, you'll see, and I'll give you opportunities to sort of raise your hand and talk about places where these concepts apply to the characters in the stories that you're working on. And the relationship is how we discover people, as I just said. It's why we want to make sure that the relationships grow and change and feel natural and all those other things. To just have a character, even think about the Tom Hanks movie where he was stranded on the island, right? They gave him Wilson, the basketball, because it's not we can't fall in love, we can't root for, we can't get engaged in just a character by themselves. We have to give them some kind of relationship. And again, what we're going to be doing today is using movie examples. Now, I know that we're writers and we're talking about books. However, the chances of us all seeing the same movie are higher than the chances of us all having read the same book. So I'm going to be using movie examples, but regularly I will ask you to sort of raise your hand and not only give me movie examples, but book examples as well. But that's why I'm talking about movie characters even though it's a writing workshop. It's a way for us to come close to all playing with the same deck of characters. So the first concept I'm going to introduce you to is probably one that's relatively familiar to you: opposites attract. It's been a long-standing story arc to bring two people who are at opposites in all kinds of ways. But the thing is, there are specific facets to opposites that you may not have realized. And some of them your readers will recognize right away. And others are things that you will be knowing and you will be creating and manipulating within your story. And your reader won't necessarily be aware of them, but they will deepen their experience. So what's the first kind of opposite? Well, the obvious is physical. We often don't think about that, but when you cast your book, make sure that your characters, particularly the ones that interact a lot, have physical differences. Now, I promise you, at the end of our time together, you will never look at a movie poster the same way again. Because take a look at this Bridget Jones poster. There's a specific reason why the heroine is a blonde, and in this case, it's a love triangle. The two men are brunettes. And if you notice with this triangle, if you're familiar with the movie, even between the two men, there are physical differences. Colin Firth is large and tall, and Hugh Grant is a smaller person. So here's where they've done all of these kinds of physical attributes and made sure that they're opposite. So what kinds of things are we looking for? First of all, like I said, short versus tall. Now, in terms of a romance, it's kind of easier for the woman to be smaller and the man to be larger, but it doesn't necessarily have to work that way. And think about all of the other characters. Think about Laurel and Hardy, for example. There's a situation where it was not a romance, it was a comedy, but I'm absolutely sure that they were cast specifically for their physical differences. I don't quite remember which was which. I think it was Laurel, who was the long, skinny guy, and Hardy, who was the smaller, rounder, physical type. So as you're creating your characters, go back and look at where are they physically different in their height. Are they slight or muscular? As I said with the Laurel and Hardy, do you have one who's curvier and one who's skinnier? If you've got two characters who are feeling similar, can you create physical differences in their body builds? Make one very, very skinny and athletic, and the other one very stocky. I always think about the two characters, the elf characters from the Lord of the Rings. There was the long, skinny elf. I'm going to get the name wrong, Legolas, and the other person in that band was this very sort of short, stocky elf or dwarf, I believe. So think about that. Start looking at your books and at movies that you watch as where are these people cast just on their appearance as distinct opposites. In terms of dark or light, now you could just be talking about complexion or hair, but you could also be talking about the way they move through the world, their personalities. Again, here's two dark-haired men with a blonde woman. You could flip it any way you wanted to, but make sure, and it could be in clothing. Think about, you've got one character who is always in lighter, airier colors, while the other one is in darker colors, or one is in light textures and the other one is in leathers and canvases and things that are heavier. I see a chat here. Do we have a question already, Jennifer? I'm going to say no. Okay.
No, we don't.
Okay. And this one is another one that's rather obvious. And there are a lot of different ways to do this. Is someone who is physically attractive versus someone who may not necessarily be unattractive, but just sort of unnoticeable. Certainly when you think of stories where one character transforms, one of the transformations you can make is someone who's been sort of very much a wallflower, very much not taking up space in the world, and have that character come into their own, not only from a personality standpoint, but from a physical standpoint. So there's a lot that you can do, and we don't always necessarily think about that at first. While there's the physical, now we can look at emotional opposites. If you've never seen the movie The African Queen, I highly recommend it. I sort of joke that I'll be stacking your Netflix playlist over the course of the next hour. It's one of the great films that are completely built upon two characters who are very, very opposite. I mean, just look at this photograph right now. The Humphrey Bogart character is rough and dirty and unkempt, and the Katharine Hepburn character is elegant and well dressed and even just she's put together. She's so much cleaner. You know, you think, how does this person going into the jungle dressed like this? And that's some physical appearances, but I love how you can see their characters in how they're costumed for this photograph. Do you have a character who's in control versus a character who's out of control? The Humphrey Bogart character in here, he's in his element. The river is his. He's the guide. He knows what's happening. And she, you can just tell by the way she's dressed, is very much out of her element. So he has much more control over the situation than she does. If you have characters that you want to have them moving toward each other over the course of the story, think about how you can put them at the opposite end of this spectrum when they start out. And they do change in terms of who's in control, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But you want to give them lots of room to move from being in control to out of control. And of course, the great fun of the plot is when you flip it. Take the person who is in control and put them in a scene or a situation where they're totally lost that control. And the person who previously didn't have any control, give them the control in a scene and watch how their characters change and interact. Here again, you're looking at elegant versus rugged. It doesn't need to be quite this distinct, but if you have a character who's tailored, who's put together, who cares about his or her appearance, whose appearance is professional or posh or anything like that, take a look at another character and give them a rougher edge. Again, it doesn't have to be, totally black and white, and your reader may or may not be aware of that. I think before I started looking at the African Queen, particularly from these criteria, a lot of it just contributed to my overall enjoyment of the film. I wasn't really aware of all the different things that were affecting me. And then as I went back and looked at it and analyzed, I began to see how much was coming into play of how much I loved these characters. Another classic is introvert versus extrovert. Who's the person who will talk to everyone? Who's the introvert who just wants all the people to go away? Again, a classic thing that you can do between two characters. And something that you can usually sort of add on if you've got characters who are feeling too similar or don't have enough distance to go to meet to each other. It doesn't necessarily even need to be romance. It can be a quest movie. It can be an adventure where you've got people who need to work together who don't stand a chance of working together at the beginning. Introvert versus extrovert. And slightly different take on that is open versus guarded. Who is the person who believes that the world is a good place and people are out to help them? Who is the person who believes that the world is a place that can harm them and he needs to be she needs to be very, very suspicious of other characters? This is going to change how they interact. It's going to change how they view each other. And you've got some wonderful situations where if you have two characters who need to work together and they have opposing viewpoints of a third character or a situation where this one person is ready to risk and ready to think, yes, we can do it. And the other character is, no, we're not ready. We don't have enough resources, what have you. So these are emotional opposites that, again, you may not have thought about at the beginning, but you can sit there and craft them into your pairs of characters. Here is a wonderful photograph from the end of The African Queen that I wanted to show you. Look at the difference between the two characters. This is a perfect example, and I'm sorry it's kind of a grainy photograph because, of course, it's a movie shot. The characters, the way they look, absolutely beautifully mirrors what happens to them inside in their personalities. He sort of cleans up a little bit, although you can't really tell it from here. The hair is down, the hat is off, the tight neck is open. So there's a situation where each of these characters has their emotional journey is mirrored by their physical appearance. Again, a little easier to do in a movie because it's a visual medium, but you can certainly put those details in any story that you're writing. So let's look at another opposite, which is what I call contextual opposites. Great movie, Kate and Leopold. Again, some of these movies are older movies, so at some point I'm going to ask you for newer examples of these kinds of concepts. But contextual is more about their world and where they came from. In this case of Kate and Leopold, it's literally a time travel, as you can tell. She's a contemporary New York executive, and he's from some past marvelous historical piece, and he time travels to her. So kind of like the control versus guarded, who's in their element and who's out of their element. He comes to contemporary Manhattan and he's completely out of his element. There's some marvelous comedic scenes of him trying to make sense of the contemporary world. And she's very much in her world. And there are, excuse me, there are a couple of scenes where it flips. And it's wonderful to watch that change, to watch him be in control and him understand the way society works. So it's a great thing that you can do to give your characters a chance to interact and explore bits of their personality with each other. Who is the actor versus the reactor? Now, this is another thing that's probably not going to be aware, your reader's not going to be directly aware of it. But if you can think, who's in charge? Who's moving the story forward? Who's the person making the decisions that make the next plot point happen? And in a good story, there should be some give and take. But generally, there'll be one character who is much more the driver of the story than the other. Interestingly enough, in several cases, think back to The Lord of the Rings with Frodo and Samwise Ganges. For the most part, Frodo is driving the story, but there are a couple of marvelous places where Sam, while he usually makes choices that make things worse, make choices that save the day, and he becomes the actor. And of course, at one of the final scenes of the movie, he becomes the person who takes charge and enables Frodo to complete his mission. So who is the actor? Who is the person driving the story forward? Who is the person being pulled along by that actor? Who is the reactor? And again, another sort of subtle facet of that is who's the observer and who's being observed. In the case of Kate and Leopold, it really does flip, but he is watching her. He is making judgments and making decisions based on what he sees by her actions. And how he responds to what she does gives us big clues to his character, and how she responds to what he does. But for the most part, for the most of the movie, he is the observer. I mean, and she's the person being observed. And then, like every good story, they do flip it for a little bit so that we get to see what each thinks of each other. But that'll give you passages for characters to talk about how they feel about other characters, to talk about, if you're talking about a love story, to have a character sort of look back and notice small things about the other person, to have a protagonist notice small things about the antagonist, little clues that the antagonist may be leaving. So observer versus observed. So those are the opposites. We can look at opposite movies. Does anyone have any ideas or suggestions before we get into the next part of getting under the skin of movies where you feel like these concepts of setting opposites across from each other? Does anyone have any movies or books that come to mind where you feel like this comes into play very strongly?
The Odd Couple.
The Odd Couple, yes. Excellent example.
Anybody else?
Casablanca is a pretty good one too.
Casablanca.
Casablanca, indeed.
think that might be it.
Okay. Well, as you think about it, we'll have another chance to go back over these. So as you think about them, just make a note to yourself and we'll come back. So getting under their skin, I think of this primarily as a romance concept, but it really has a lot of other places where it creates in ensemble casts, in buddy movies, things like that. Getting under the skin. It's where one character begins to really interact on a deeper level with another, be it love or friendship or an alliance for some kind of mission. And there's a couple of different elements to this. The first one is irritation versus attraction. I mean, there's the old saying, what's the opposite of hate? It's not love, it's apathy. I mean, what's the opposite of love? It's not hate, it's apathy. So here's a situation kind of like The Odd Couple where, but there's an attraction piece of it. This is a movie called How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, where the whole setup is about two people who could not be more at odds with each other. And now, keeping in mind what we heard about before, look at that movie poster and see one's a blonde, one's a brunette. He's dressed in dark, she's dressed in yellow colors. He's got a very sharp, I think it's even a tuxedo that he's wearing. She's in something very flowy. So once your radar goes up for these elements, it's interesting to see how you start to discover them everywhere. So one of the ways to do the irritation versus attraction is to take a stereotype and deconstruct it. This is definitely happening in How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. He's very much the money-minded deal maker. And we slowly begin to see that element in his character kind of fall apart a little bit. And there's marvelous scenes where she intentionally pokes fun at and tries to pull down that sort of stereotype. And he has to put up with it because he has to stay with her to win a deal. And she just becomes this really cringeworthy girlfriend. And it's just hysterical. But we're taking a stereotype and pulling it apart and finding something new and surprising about it. And readers love that because they kind of know what you started with, and they're having fun watching you poke it apart, just like she does in the movie. You might want to take a character's values, money, power, and undermine them. Give them a situation where they're going to have to do a trade-off. They're going to have to not be so concerned about power. In the Matthew McConaughey character, he ends up having to put his personal relationship ahead of securing the deal. And that's something that completely conflicts with his values at the beginning of the movie. So we see him behaving one way that's actually quite a stereotype. And we watch him move to where those values have been undermined, and now he has new values. And that transformation is why we love story. That's why we feel like a story is significant, and we feel like we want to root for those characters, and we feel satisfied when the story is done. They could be in direct opposition, where you've got two people who need the same thing. They're either in competition for an object, or they are set out either professionally or personally to oppose the goals of the other. So it could be something as simple as she wants to buy the farm and he doesn't want to sell it, or this corporation wants to purchase this land and the community doesn't want to give it. So it could be just something as simple as direct opposition. This is good, a special good element to use for cat and mouse stories. Think Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty. They're fascinated with each other, even though they really don't want to admit it. So there's a lot of push and pull happen where you've got someone chasing someone else. There has to be this fascination behind the chase and the little character pieces that we're discovering. So the irritation versus attraction works really well, not only just in the romance, but in a cat and mouse story or a mystery, something like that. Going back to what I said before in Botched, hate isn't the opposite of love. Apathy is the opposite of love. And particularly in romances, readers love friends to, enemies to friends or friends to lovers, or situations where someone starts out absolutely having no regard for the other person whatsoever. They don't like them. They don't want to have anything to do with them. and we watch them slowly come to an affection. It's why there have been so many versions of Pride and Prejudice. It's just a wonderful version of this. They can't stand each other at the beginning, and slowly they fall in love. So the reason why it works, the reason why we love it so much is that it gives us tons of room for the character to move. They have a long distance to go for them to get to the point where they're aligned or in love. And that makes for a great story. We see each character make significant transformations. And that's what we love as readers. We want to watch people change. I mean, and quite frankly, from a romance standpoint, it makes the best kisses. It really, when you've got someone who just, they almost can't bring themselves to submit to the kiss, is a marvelous scene. If you look at some of these, it's just wonderful. So if you're writing a romance, that sort of enemies to lovers often gives the best sort of final reveal. Unless it's not believable, you really have to make sure that when these characters move toward each other, there are concrete character specific reasons. We have to believe that she comes to admire him and why. We have to believe that he comes to discover that his original opinion of her was wrong and why. So it's good for you to sort of know why it is that they can form an alliance before you start the story. That way you can push it as far as you can to the opposite end, but you know what brings them back together. If it isn't believable to us as a reader, we'll feel manipulated and we won't buy into the story. So you need to know the underlying similarities. That's how you get to the believability. What is it? Where's the values that they share? What is it about the way he conducts himself as he changes that the other character can like and admire and respect? Where are the underlying similarities? And then you can craft reasons why those similarities aren't apparent at first, why they're hidden. The Darcy character is sort of dark and doesn't want to be with anybody and really doesn't, is just not at all warm or looking like he's even remotely capable of loving. But we do see, if you go back and sort of pick through it, and even with the African Queen, you can see the underlying similarities, so that in retrospect, if you went back to it, you'd go, oh, that's why it works. That's why she can feel this way. That's why they can team up. So you've got to know the underlying similarities for it to really work. And this works especially well with quest stories, with adversaries that become allies. Think of, or buddy movies, think of things like Lethal Weapon, where these two cops could not be more dissimilar, but we watch them form a team. A lot of this in the Avenger stories, you see that come out, where there are people who are adversaries or cannot seem to cooperate, but slowly we learn why they have some of the same values and what it is that enables them to work together. So if you've got a quest story, even if it's just a buddy movie or if it's a large ensemble cast, you want to know why those adversaries can come to work together. And we're going to love it when you do. We're going to feel like that's a really great story and it's going to stick with us. You can't always do that, though. You can't always have them start out at opposite ends of the world. So this is what I refer to as endearing bit by bit. When you've got two characters who need to come together, but by virtue of the plot or the story that you've got, or where they are in that ensemble cast, they don't start out so far apart. How do you give them a good, solid story arc that's going to feel satisfying to your reader? Music and Lyrics is a great movie that does that. They don't start off hating each other. They're sort of fascinated by each other, but at the same time, they have a great, powerful arc during the course of the movie. So how does that happen? Well, I think you have to at least make sure there's some place for us to go. So don't get them started together so close that they don't have any growth to accomplish, to get next to each other, to be able to align. So you can't start them right next to each other in terms of character. It's just not an interesting story. So make sure that they at least have somewhere to go to travel toward each other for either their romantic relationship or their friendship or their alliance, or if you're writing a family story of a family coming together, same thing. One of the easiest ways to accomplish this and still give it sort of a robust storyline is what I call one step forward, two steps back. So have one character make a gesture or an action or a plot point that moves the story forward, and then have them mess it up. I laugh and say this is Hugh Grant's entire career. He's made an entire career of movies of doing something really wonderful and romantic and endearing and then messing it up. And then he has to come back in the next scene and do this really charming apology for how he messed it up. So go ahead and give them a step forward, but then have one character sort of undermine what they did. And this is the way human nature works. So we'll believe it, that made a great step forward, but messed it up. And now we got to go back and patch the holes. In order for us to see those two people come together and for that one step forward, two steps back, is that we have to sort of see chinks in their armor. We have to see little tiny pieces of their personality that let us know there's a tender guy under that gruff exterior, or there's a really lovely woman under that cutthroat executive. Give them little believable chinks. Don't have the hardcore shoot 'em up gangster, pick up a duck, a duckling and be nice to it. It's got to be something relatively believable. Pets are, by the way, animals and pets are great for that. And children are awesome, wonderful things to put into a story, because children will make us admit things that we would never admit. And people behave differently to animals. New sides of them come out. So give us believable chinks. If you've got somebody who's really, really rough and hard and you need him to have a softer side, put him with an animal or someone who needs his care or what have you. Even a plant. Honestly, there's just something where you show him being cared. So give us believable chinks so that endearing can happen for us, not only for the characters, for each other, but for us, for the characters. Now, let's talk about arguments. Arguments are hands down my favorite place to show characterization. One of the best arguments in television history has to be the argument between Sam and Diane from Cheers. Cheers was a 1980s, I believe, television. You can go to Google and just Google the final argument, Sam and Diane. It was one of the most watched episodes in television. Everybody was talking about it the next day. That was the original water cooler moment, where you had two characters who had been at odds with each other for several seasons of the series. And the argument that they had where they finally got together was brilliantly done. But then again, I want you to stop and look at this. Look at the physicality here. We've got a blonde and a brunette. We've got a very sports jock guy and a very intellectual, tailored woman. Again, gender isn't specific. You could flip that and it would totally work. But I think after tonight, you'll start to look at how these characters are paired together and how you layer all of these elements to create great character relationships. Arguments are wonderful because people slip up and they tell the truth in arguments. If you get really good and mad, you'll say that thing that you've been holding back for a while. And that certainly happens in this situation. So if you've got a character who we need to learn something about them, or they know a secret, an argument is an excellent place to have that slip out. I love arguments where actual emotional attachment gets slipping out. I can't believe I care about you, or all that other, don't go ahead and do that because you might get hurt, kind of thing. You want to go ahead and get them so riled up that their editor shuts off and they say what they really mean. So that's one of the greatest things that you can do with an argument. But in order for us to believe it, we have to know why they care enough to fight at all, right? If you've got two characters who are fighting just because I don't know, some reason that doesn't really like emotionally make sense. It's not personal. So don't have them fighting over the dishwasher and who unloaded the dishwasher. Although any of us who've been in a marriage for any period of time know that often the fight about unloading the dishwasher isn't about unloading the dishwasher at all. It's about something completely, the dishwasher just happens to be the manifestation of where all that frustration shows up. So the fight itself could be over something small, but we have to know what they're really fighting about with each other and why that matters, why it cares, why they don't just want to throw their hands up and walk away and just not invest in it. So make sure we know why they care enough, and make sure that you position that argument at a place where we've had the chance to watch them come to care enough to fight. You can't do the Sam and Diane fight in the first season. You can't do it in the first chapter. It won't make any sense because we have to know what they're really fighting about and why they care enough to battle. And here again is a little bit more necessarily in movies, but it's very true in books as well, is to get the physicality right. Make sure they're moving toward each other or moving back or hitting things or, excuse me, I'm fighting a cold, or pursuing each other down a hallway or what have you. Make sure the physicality doesn't feel contrived and it feels appropriate for the characters. Again, the physicality in the Sam and Diane argument is wonderful. Through most of this series, they're on, and you can see it in this photograph, they're on opposite sides of a bar. Diane is the bar waitress and she's sort of wandering around the tables around the bar, and Sam is always behind the bar. So there's always a bar between them, and there's marvelous pieces of this argument where they're literally chasing each other around the furniture. It makes total sense. We love it. We may not really know why we love it, but we love it. Then there are times where it's not about the words at all. This is a wonderful scene. Again, much more difficult to do in books, but if you can get it right, it's wonderful. This is the scene, if you remember from It's a Wonderful Life, where they're talking to the plastics guy, I think his name is Sam, and they're saying the most inane things into the phone. But it's not about what's being said at all. It's all about, I mean, the way he looks at her, you can just tell his brain is just going, oh, she smells wonderful. I want to be so close to her. And they're trying really hard not to be so incredibly enthrallingly aware of how close they are to each other. They've been forced by this vehicle of this telephone. So sometimes it's not about the words at all. One of my favorite scenes was from a Maggie Osborne novel where the hero is a sort of rough and tumble Wild West cowboy. And the heroine is this marvelously, it's a lot like The African Queen, where she's a very prim and proper, very well-educated, very cultured. And there's this wonderful scene where when he finally woos her, when she finally sort of gives in to her affection for him, he's setting the table for their dinner together. And at the last moment, and there's not a word spoken. He goes and he takes the knife on the table setting and he turns it, I believe it's blade in. Whatever is the most etiquette, from a manners standpoint, what's the most appropriate way to place a knife? And she sees him doing it. And she knows that he's figured it out, that he's watched her. And it's this wonderful moment. And there's not a word spoken, but it's just this act of him taking this tiny little detail that he knows matters so much to her and honors all the things that she cares about. It's a fabulous scene. And that's done completely in a book. It's not a movie at all. So sometimes it's not about the words at all. So now that you've gotten your characters toward each other, we need to make it count. Now, how do you, what I call, raise the stakes? How do you take the relationship and turn it up a notch, and then turn it up another notch, and then turn it up a notch after that, so that you're continually building to that climax that we love in a good book? The first thing you want to think about is, what does one character have that the other character? I love to find these sort of raising the stakes in terms of questions. So what has he got that she needs? Or vice versa. One of the great examples of this is My Fair Lady. What has he got? What has she got? What do they need? So what is it? Could it be just an object? Does he or she have something the other character wants? Could it be information? If you're doing a spy novel or a mystery, there might be information. Could it be virtue? And in this case, I don't mean virtue like, betting a young woman. I mean, in terms of, is there some part of one character's makeup, their personality, their values that the other person wants and feels that they're lacking? Is it status? Does the other person give the opportunity to give power or money or whatever to the other character? So think about, what's the answer to this question? What does he have that she needs? Or what does she have that he needs? And then why? Why do they need it? And again, even if you're just talking about an object, it's never really about the object. If he wants to break into a bank so that he can, or break into an electronics store so that he can buy a large screen television, it's never just about the large screen television. It's successful people have giant televisions. He wants to show off for his friends or whatever. So once you figured out what it is that the character wants, dig a little deeper and figure out, why do they need it? Why do they want it? What do they think it's going to get them? And they're not always right? Sometimes they think they're going to get from something and it doesn't actually play out that way. So why does he need it? Does he know he needs it, right? One of the great things about My Fair Lady is the Professor Higgins, the story I've grown accustomed to her face, where he realizes he needs her. And he doesn't even know it for the whole story until the end. And we're watching, we know it, we know ahead of it that he needs her. But one of the things that keeps us watching is us knowing that he's going to come to that conclusion at some point, or hoping that he's going to come to that conclusion. So if you can craft a situation where your character needs something and they haven't quite figured it out at first, they're not really aware of it, and you slowly build them coming to understand why they need this other person in their lives, that will absolutely win your reader over. So does he know he needs it? And does the reader know? Like I said, you want to get that marvelous balance of the reader knowing something just ahead of the character, so that we're pulling for them to figure it out, so that it's the sort of the great balance between, oh, I knew it and I didn't see that coming. You want to have those moments for both of your for your characters. You want both of those moments. And in terms of their characters, we want to say, I was waiting for him to figure that out. But at the same time, we need to know that he was capable of figuring out, and it sort of makes sense for the character. So you want to keep your reader just a couple of steps ahead of your characters if you can. That's really great writing. This is one of my favorite questions. Why is she the worst person in the world to give it to him? Sometimes if you're creating characters, if you can think about what would be the last person in the world that would help this character achieve this goal. French Kiss is a great movie about this. I mean, if you've ever wanted to see Kevin Kline speak like a native French speaker, he just does a spectacular job with the language in this film. Meg Ryan he's the last person in the world who should be helping the Meg Ryan character. She's coming to Europe to win back her fiance. He's a robber, he's a thief, and he slips I believe it's a necklace into her backpack, so that he makes her part of his robbery, and they're stuck together. And as he falls for her, you watch him try to help her win back this fiance, and slowly he's realizing he doesn't want her to go back to the fiance. So he's the last person in the world who should be helping her, but he does. And then there's the wonderful moment where they realize they're great for each other. She starts out sort of very, I don't want to say mousy, but really not a very stylish person. And there's a spectacular scene where she comes down in, I believe it's a red dress, in order to catch the eye of the fiance. And the moment that the Kevin Kline character sees her in this red dress that he's basically made happen, it's wonderful. So you want to undermine their motive. Their original motive for the movie, his original motive was to find somebody who would unwillingly help him pull off this theft. And that motive becomes destroyed because they want to be together. Frustrating the efforts. There's one Samwise, Ganges, and Frodo, where Frodo has this particular mission, and Sam keeps making choices that mess it up, that make it more difficult. Now, he does redeem himself in the end, but Sam makes a couple of moves that make it much harder for Frodo than it ought to have been. So where can you, and so in buddy movies, in buddy movies, or even in like ensemble quest pieces, where can you have one character either because of the way they view the world or just not thinking about it? Where can they frustrate the efforts of your main character, of your actor, the person who's the driving the story forward? Where can the people around him frustrate his efforts? The reason why we love this is it forces growth or change in uncomfortable ways. One of the really funny moments, again, is that scene where she comes out in the dress, but there's all these other things in the Meg Ryan character that she's not used to being much of an adventurer, and she's forced to be more adventurous, even in terms of the food that she eats. It just shows up in all these marvelous details over the course of the movie. So where can you force growth in change or uncomfortable ways because they're dealing with the last person who should be aiding them in their mission or their quest or their goals for the movie or the book? So again, buddy stories are a great place for this to happen. Romances are. Does anyone have any examples where you've got people who shouldn't be together or whose goals are opposite each other? Think about all of that motivational opposition. What are some movies that come to mind where you see that come into play?
Any ideas? Hunger Games?
Hunger Games. Excellent.
I think that's it.
Okay. Here's another question that is specific for romance, but also I think applies on a lesser level to almost every other story. What will it cost her to be with him? Or what will it cost him to be with her? The most obvious example comes from Lord of the Rings, where she's the elvish, I hope I had that right, princess. And in order to be with Aragorn, she must give up her immortality. Well, if you want to go for high stakes, that's about as high as it gets. So what will it cost him or her to be with them? When I begin to write a romance, that's one of the questions I need to know the answer of. What will they have to lay down in order to create this relationship? What will they have to give up, or what will they have to deny, or what will they have to accept as a lie, or what will they have to change about themselves? So it could be emotionally. It could be they need to stop being so distrustful, or they need to try and open up. So there could be something that they have to, excuse me, change about themselves emotionally in order to have this relationship or this alliance. It could be spiritually. I write faith-based romance. There's a lot of things that my characters need to change about themselves and the way they view their faith in order to accept the relationship that's in front of them. So there may be spiritual aspects that, again, might not be something that's really obvious to your reader, but does he see his purpose in the world? Does he understand that there's good in him and good in other people? Can he forgive the person who's wronged him or her, so that she can have a relationship with another person that's deep and meaningful, and she can sort of drop that shell that she's had? Sometimes it's physical. Sometimes someone has to slash and burn their way through a war or a challenge, or to get to him or her or their partner. Think about Indiana Jones and all the things he had to go through to get his quest. So sometimes it's going to cost them physically. They may come away with a wound. That's always an interesting story aspect of what happens when they're willing to put their physical abilities on the line and perhaps sacrifice one of them in order to make the mission work or the alliance happen, or to win the heart of his or her beloved. The basic question is, how does he change her forever? How does she change him forever? How does their friendship change each other forever? You think about, someone said Casablanca, the relationship between Louis and, I can't think of it, but the two relationships, their relationship is changed forever by the course of that movie. They start out sort of adversarial and they come together for a larger purpose. So we love the stories where people change forever, where the transformation that we see between the characters is deep and meaningful and something that we can root for. That's what makes a story feel really satisfying and significant. And those are the stories that end up on our keeper shelves. So here's a piece. I wanted to give you a written example since I've done so many movies. Here's a situation where we're watching all of that come together. We're watching that transformation. And I'm not going to read it to you because we have the joy of you being able to see it. But I'm going to give you a few minutes to read just this passage of that moment where that transformation happens. So just to give you a little bit of background so you understand why this works, is she is looking to open a coffee shop in Seattle, where there are already a gazillion coffee shops. And her loan officer is a British man who loves tea and not coffee. And so there's this wonderful moment where he shows her the tea ceremony, not the Japanese one that we all think of, but there's a Chinese tea ceremony that men perform for women. And he shows her this, and it's coming apart. And so she pulls back on that. But what you're seeing here is, it's very visual. She's showing us what she sees in this moment of transformation. He's breaking a dozen rules by kissing her. And they both tried not to have this relationship because obviously he's her loan officer in the bank, and lots of bad things would happen. But this is the moment where he chooses her over what could happen for him at the bank. And so I just wanted you to see what that looks like in writing. One of the things you can do, and I often tell people to do, is if there's a moment in the movie that speaks to that to you, that you really feel captures that, go online, look. In many cases, there is either an official or an unofficial transcript of the screenplay, and you can go back and look at the actual words. Now, you're not going to have, because most screenplays don't have the action and the narrative, but you'll get to see the words and the dialogue that are involved. So I just wanted you to have a chance to see that, and it's one of my favorite of my books that does that. So let's go squarely into the romance world for a minute and talk about people falling in love. Talk about them making alliances and becoming the forever soulmate of each other. Happens a couple of different ways. One is just charming moments. This is the "You Complete Me" speech from Jerry Maguire that Tom Cruise is so famous for. If you've ever heard, I think it was most recently I saw a version of it in Ted Lasso, where one of the guy comes up and he's talking about all this stuff and the other character says, "You had me at coach." Well, in this case, he gives this big long speech and she says, "You had me at hello," I think it is. Charming moments are where the facade comes off, are where we see there's so much at stake that they realize they can't keep the facade up anymore and they show their true feelings. That's why we love charming moments. They tend to be long-awaited admissions. They're things that we've known about the character for a long time and they're not saying, or they're, that the sort of the banker and the coffee person, they've been attracted to each other for the whole book and they've just been choosing to not give in to that. And the moment that they give in are those wonderful admissions. Hugh Grant's entire career, like I said, the idea of the charming moment where the facade comes off. Just about every Hugh Grant movie ever made has that moment, and he is exquisite at it. Really, really good job. Matthew McConaughey also does a good job, and there are a couple of other contemporary actors who do it. But that moment where they just lay it all on the line because they just can't help it. We love it. We'll eat that up. So think about where does your protagonist come undone? Where can't they hold it together anymore? Where are the stakes too high? Where are they willing to risk it all? Where can it all go horribly wrong, but it does go wonderfully right? Those are the charming moments. So you want to make sure that you build those into your story. In the end, don't have too many charming moments up front because that's not where they belong. They belong in the last acts of your story. Also in the last acts of your story is the big reveal, that dramatic moment where someone reveals their feelings for another person. This is the great waterfall scene from Last of the Mohicans. It's where the line, "Stay alive no matter what occurs and I will find you," comes from. They may never see each other again. He may die trying to save her and he makes this sort of epic. But it doesn't always have to be that way. Sometimes it's very small. There was a line from the movie As Good as It Gets, Jack Nicholson, who is about as unromantic as you can get during the course of the movie. And then at one point he looks at, I believe it's Helen Hunt, and says, "You make me want to be a better man." Now, because he's done nothing romantic or declarative through the whole course of the movie, as a matter of fact, he's just been sort of a prickly, obnoxious guy, it's huge to us. So it can be small, but if it's the only time and it's set up properly, it has all the weight that it needs and it becomes a big reveal. Sometimes it's natural, a sort of low-key natural declaration from someone who's been dramatic and over the top all the movie. This is from Notting Hill. It's the Julian, I can't think of her name right now. It's another Hugh Grant movie. And she's this gigantic, high-powered movie star. And at this point in the movie, she comes into his bookstore and says, "I'm just a girl standing in front of a boy, asking him to love her." I mean, the reason why these lines are so iconic and so many people can quote them is because they're beautifully crafted big reveals. They have all the stakes behind them, and they're so distinct from the way the characters behaved for the rest of the story. There's the ultimate promise: stay alive no matter what occurs, I will find you. This works because we know the stakes, that this character has been built up as a man of ultimate principle who will go the full mile to achieve something. He has a lot of honor, a lot of virtue. So we believe that. And he simply says to her, "Stay alive and I will find you." And of course, he does. So where can your protagonist, if you're not talking about a romance, where can your protagonist make his crucial alliance? Where can they decide to work together even though they haven't in the past? So there are a lot of other places outside of the romance for this to work. But think about, where is the moment where your character lays it all on the line. What about them takes them to that moment? What makes that the make or break decision for them? So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how this actually happens, right? There's a lot of ideas that I've just given you. How do we actually sort of craft that? How does it show up in a book? Well, it's really not that complicated. This is how I do it. These are my kitchen cabinets. No kidding. This is an actual photograph. The pink Post-it note is the name of each character. And then the little yellow Post-it notes are some of these elements that I walk through my kitchen. I have a very, very cooperative husband who'll let me keep it up for days. And I'll just put things as they come to me. And we'll see how it works. So I just let it bubble on a visual. Post-it notes on a wall are one of my favorite ways to work things out. I think you can see it here. I'm going to pull aside the curtain behind me to show you the glass block wall that has dozens and dozens and dozens of Post-it notes on it for my next book. Great planning device, but it could be just that simple. Now that on the wall kind of Post-it note, living with it for a couple of days, turns into this. This chart, this is for an actual book. And here's all those different elements where Max hides nothing. He's an open book. He doesn't believe in hiding anything. You know everything about him from the moment you meet him. Whereas Heather hides everything. She's very closed, right? He's the open character. She's the closed. Something that the reader would probably never pick up on, obviously, is that everything about Max has edges. He drives a boxy car. A lot of things about him are sharp. He wears leather coats with zippers and things like that. So he has edges. Everything about him has edges. Where Heather has curves. She loves flamingos. She wears a lot of flowing clothes. Again, that's not something you're going to notice overtly, but it's going to be one of those layers that creates a full, developed, and depth character for you. His gift to her, I always think, what's his gift to her? His gift to Heather is that he allows her to risk, and she hasn't risked. And her gift to him is that she makes him grieve and heal. He's been wounded. This is a story of a man who uses a wheelchair. And so he's wounded. No one thinks he's healthy because he's in a wheelchair, but he's actually much healthier than she is. No one realizes she's hurting. She has a burn wound that she never lets anyone see. Max is hard, Heather is soft. Max is primarily found in black and dark clothes. Because of the flamingos and everything else, we see Heather a lot in pink. Max is disorganized. He shoots from the hip. Heather is a planner. Max is an instigator. He likes to make trouble. Heather is a peacemaker. She's a high school counselor. So you see, sometimes I get one and I have to figure out what the opposite is of the other. And sometimes I get both at the same time. But you want to just go ahead and begin building all of this. It says he hurt her by disregarding her plan. She hurts him by, I hadn't figured it out yet. And then I was thinking, all right, Max, at this point, I didn't know about her burn. So I didn't know what her wound was. And then from a history standpoint, Max was the cool guy in the high school in crowd, and Heather was in the high school out crowd for a lot of ways. So you can see where not all of these things are going to show up overtly in the story, but I know they're there and they color how the character behaves and how they interact with each other. So sometimes it's just as simple as creating a chart. So here's again, your turn. You've had a chance to think about it. Castle's one of the great places where we saw that, but where are some other movies or books where we've got opposites? Anybody have something they want to suggest as a good opposites movie? Not a lot of ideas coming forth today.
No, can't think of anything.
All right. Well, remember, these were the, oh, I heard somebody.
No, that's just the background in the life.
Okay. So remember, we're looking at opposites. We're looking at how the characters get under each other's skin. We want to watch that. It's fun for us. It's what makes the story entertaining. We want to raise the stakes, make sure that there's something really significant at stake for each character. And we want to watch them fall for each other, even if they're just falling as friends or allies. We want to watch that relationship come through. If you're familiar at all with Castle, The series kind of fell flat once the two of them got together, because we lost a lot of this. They weren't as much opposites. They weren't getting each other under each other's skins. The stakes were all external and not internal. And then they kept dreaming up stakes for the two of them, and it never worked. And we'd watch them fall. So sometimes you have to be very careful of your timing. So I want to give you some final thoughts about characters. I don't know if this is a real billboard, but I wish it was. I want to believe in happy endings. I make my living writing happy endings, so that's great. I also write murder mysteries too, so got a little yin and yang going on here. But here are some final thoughts about characterizations before we open it up for questions. There are no new stories under the sun. There really aren't. So if you are stuck, think about what archetypal story your story feels like, and then use that as a jumping off point. I mean, it's a reason why if you do it right, we won't care. So there's lots of Romeo and Juliet stories that it's been redone a million different times. There's Eliza and Professor Higgins, where one character transforms the other, usually for a not great, not moral reason, and then slowly it becomes because he or she truly cares about the other person. There's Cinderella and Prince Charming, where there's one person saving another person, or they're creating something. Those are sort of falling out of grace. You have to do it right in this day and age to get Cinderella and Prince Charming. But the point is, if you take an old story archetype and you do it right, we will not care. We will know, oh, look, this is a retelling of whatever. And if we love the story and the characters and it all makes sense, we won't care. We won't care that you're redoing something else. You know, it's not the same as plagiarism. You're taking a story archetype and transforming it into something new. One of the things I want to leave you to exploring for characters are the actual archetypes. There's a million different charts of this on the internet. I could give you dozens of examples, but I think you should go to the internet, look at character archetypes, and wander through the charts and the descriptions until you find one that makes it clear to you. The way I like to use this is if I've got a character, let's say the caregiver, that green one on the left side. If I've got a character who's a caregiver, if I want someone to be in opposition with them, I'm best to choose someone on the opposite side of that circle. So I'm going to choose a magician or a creator or a hero. If I have someone who's a ruler, that blue down on the bottom, and they need an ally or a sidekick or a best friend, I'm going to put them in the innocent or the sage. So when you're building ensemble casts, when you're creating pairs of characters, again, all of these, the names aren't necessarily indicative of the character. You know, they're just names. The lovers aren't all lovers. The jesters aren't all fools. But it's a great place for you to think about how can you put those people together. So go ahead and find one of these, and it's a great place to start if you're casting a story. It's also a great place to look if you can't quite figure out why something doesn't work. My final thought for you is one of the things of all the things that you need to do is you got to love your characters. If you don't love them, if they don't strike you as real, if you don't care about them, if they don't make you cry, if they don't make you laugh, we're not going to love them. We're not going to laugh about them. We're not going to want to keep them. So my final thought is make sure that you love all of your characters, even the ones you're supposed to hate. Know why you love them, know why they're great characters, and make sure they feel satisfying to you and they surprise you and they feel like real people to you. I tell the funny story of my husband when I first started writing, my children were young, and I would come downstairs to dinner and I would talk about all of these people like they were real because they were real to me. And my children were in grade school. At one point, my husband looked at my kids and said, "You have to understand, not all mommy's friends are real." So they have to feel fully developed for you in order for them to feel fully developed for us. So here are some of the ways you can get in touch with me. You can email me at allie@alliepleiter.com. You can see all the books at alliepleiter.com. If you are a writer and you would like to get involved in the writer community and the chunky method, which is that that productivity system that she talked about in the introduction. The fastest way to do that is to pull out your cell phone and text the word chunky to 22828. That will get you into my system and will bring you onto the Chunky Nation, which is just a whole group of writers and resources and a resource library and a newsletter and things like that. So I'd love to have you involved with that. But I also wanted to leave a little bit of time for us to actually answer questions. So I'm going to go ahead. Jennifer, if you would put Chunky to 22828 in the chat so that I can turn this screen off.
Yep, hang on just a second.
There we go. And then we'll have some time to answer questions.
Can you give me the number again?
It's the word chunky, and it's 22828. And that couldn't be a question. You could just say, oh, this made the most sense to me, or I'm going to use this tactic, or this tactic is part of the book that I'm working on right now. It can be comments as well as questions.
So one of the things I noticed when you were talking about, especially the opposites section, is the second season of Bridgerton is so much this. So if you haven't, if that's something you're interested in, you haven't watched it, it's definitely so much that. Yeah.
Yes. And it works on more than one level, because it's not only him and her, but the two sisters are set up as opposites. So if you're writing love triangles, you want to make sure that all three are, whatever the two opposites, you want to make sure there's opposites to choose from. But excellent point.
So did y'all have any questions here in the room?
Does it take from the time she starts planning characters to the end of her first draft?
How long does it take from when you start planning characters to the end of your first draft?
Well, because I am a productivity expert, I know exactly the answer to that. For me, it's 14 weeks, top to bottom. Now, I am in category romance, so it's all about speed. And my books are slightly smaller. They're 55,000 words. I am more of a pantser than an outliner, so I need to know certain bones, but a lot of things get revealed to me. And I am a big believer in powering all the way through the first draft before I go back and edit, because I think there are things that you learn by taking the story all the way to its conclusion that inform how you edit. So when I coach people and when we create writing practices for people, my number one goal is to get them all the way through that first draft. And for me, it's 14 weeks, but for other people, it can be, a year or 6 months or whatever. It's very specific to each person. Unless you're under contract, then you just got to deliver it when you got to deliver it.
What are some tips that you use to get through writer's block?
Well, I tend not to have writer's block because of the concept of the chunky method is that you identify how much your brain can hop ahead in one sitting, how much creativity do you have, and it's usually a word count. Like I know that I'm capable of about 1,200 words every day. And I literally, if I tried to do more, I would probably run into writer's block because I know that's my sort of creative battery. That's my chunk. So my way of doing it is knowing exactly how much I can hop, what's the next lily pad that I can hop to get across the pond, and never setting myself up to have to need to demand more than that from myself.
I'm putting the title of your book here in the chat. Hold on just a second.
For the nutshell, the chunky method.
Can you kind of do a nutshell of what the chunky method is?
Yes. Hang on one second. I'll get a copy of the book.
Okay. And we ordered copies of this book, so you can check them out from the library.
Here's the chunky method handbook. If I can get it right.
Yep.
The chunky method is you figure out what your chunk is, and it's specific to every writer. It is very individualized, but it is very consistent. And part of the problem is that we think we're not consistent. So you figure out what your chunk is. And when you know that chunk, it could be 200 words, it could be 500 words, it could be 1,200 words, it could be 3,000 words. It's specific to each writer, and there are behavioral characteristics of big chunk writers and small chunk writers. Once you know that, you can figure out how many chunks does it take to get to the end of the book. Pardon me?
Oh, no, just weirdness happening over here.
Okay, weirdness is fine. Weirdness is everywhere. So you think about how many chunks will it take you? My romances for Love Inspired are 55,000 words. So I can't think of it off the top of my head, but how many, if I write 1,200 words every time I sit down, how many times do I need to sit down to get to that 5,500 word? And there are just concepts in how you get through that. How do you establish a writing practice? How many times a week do you write? These are all the elements of the chunky method. And so you can either do it with a workshop, or you can read the book, or I do individual coaching, just to get to the point where you establish a writing practice that's not based on somebody else's idea of what a serious writer does. Right? There are people who say, if you don't write every day, you're not serious. And I could not disagree more. So you figure out what your personal style is, and you build a plan that is based on that, so that you know, like when I sit down and write my 1,200 words, I know I'm capable of that because that's my chunk. If I tried to write 2,000 words, I would be frustrated, and I guarantee you I would get 1,200 good words and 800 lousy words. So that's the concept of the chunky method. It's basically, it's project management for creative people.
Ooh, I like that. Any other?
Somebody said to me once, you quantified the creative process, and I never knew that was possible. And that's one of my favorite compliments of the chunky method.
Does you work on multiple books at once or one at a time?
Do you do multiple books at once or one at a time?
I am always working on 4 books at a time, but I am only actively writing one. I will be editing, right now, I am actively writing one book. I am going through the copy edits of a second book. I am promoting the book that came out in April, and I am getting ready to propose the next year's books. So there's a big, if you're familiar with engineering at all, there's a big Gantt chart on my wall. It's kind of like a flow chart of where everything has to go. And to give you sort of the professional value of that, last year, was it last year? It all molds together. It might have been 2020. I signed 2 contracts with 2 different publishers for 9 books over 2.5 years. Now, that was awesome because it meant I was employed for the next 2.5 years. But I had to sit down and figure out the due dates for all of those books so that they meshed and each publisher could agree to the due dates. And that was a huge effort of the chunky method. That was a lot of calculations and about 4 hours and a lot of spreadsheets, so that I knew. And I'm literally finishing up the last book in that contract next month, and we nailed it. Every single one has come in on time.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Allie.
Pleasure.
We did purchase copies of Allie's book. They are here in the library if you want to check them out. You can also, if you want a copy of her chunky method, how to write when everything goes wrong, for yourself to own, our local independent bookshop here in Fort Worth, the Dock. We work with them when we have authors come in. They should also have copies. We did record this and some of our previous writing workshops, and you can find them on our YouTube channel. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. And then our next writing workshop will be in August, and we're going to be discussing how to become a more creative writer. So keep an eye out on our website calendar at fortworthlibrary.org for more information. And thank you again, Allie.
Well, I love it. Thank you so much. I hope that you all are able to create marvelous characters, and I'll look forward to hearing from some of you of how it worked out and how you were able to be helped by the ideas that I gave you tonight.
Thank you.